The morning sun cast golden light across the floating city of Ethon Prime. The crystal towers rose high above the endless fields of grain that covered the planet below. Children ran through the transparent walkways, their laughter echoing through the peaceful halls. The Vellani people had built their world without war, without weapons. Without the need for either, Kira stood on the observation deck, watching the harvest machines move through the fields like gentle giants. Her silver skin caught the sunlight, and her large violet eyes reflected the beauty of her home. She pressed her palm against the crystal wall and felt the thoughts of her people flowing around her like a warm river. This was how the Vellani lived, connected, peaceful, in harmony with everything around them. The first sign of trouble came as a shadow across the sky. A massive ship appeared above the city, larger than anything the Vellani had ever built. Dark metal surface was covered in strange markings and weapon ports that meant nothing to a people who had never seen instruments of war. More ships followed, dozens of them, surrounding the planet like predators circling prey. Elder Thane, the oldest and wisest of the Vellani, felt the fear ripple through his people's shared consciousness. He had lived for 300 years and had never experienced anything like the cold, empty thoughts that seemed to pour down from the ships above. These beings, whatever they were, thought in ways that hurt to touch. The communication came in. Harsh electronic bursts that the Vellani computers barely managed to translate. The message was simple and terrible. You will surrender your world and your people to the hegemony. Resistance will result in total extinction. The Vellani had no weapons to resist with. They had no soldiers to fight with. They had lived in peace for so long that the very concept of war seemed like a story from another universe. But they understood death, and they understood slavery, and they knew they did not want either. The hegemony ships began their work with mechanical precision. Landing craft descended like metal rain, each one carrying soldiers that were no longer fully alive. The hegemony troops were beings that had been changed, their flesh replaced with metal, their thoughts controlled by machines. They moved with perfect coordination, feeling no pain, showing no mercy. Kira watched in horror as the soldiers marched through her city. They took the children first, scanning them with strange devices before loading them into transport pods. Sorted into groups, some for labor, some for experiments, some for purposes too terrible to understand. The elderly, they simply eliminated as inefficient. The crystal towers that had stood for 1,000 years cracked and fell under the weight of hegemony mining equipment. The beautiful fields below were stripped bare, the soil itself scooped up and processed for resources. In just 3 days. A world that had taken millennia to build was being torn apart piece by piece. Elder Thane gathered the remaining members of the council in the deepest chamber of the last standing tower. Around him, the strongest minds of his people sat in a circle, their thoughts joined in desperate purpose. They could feel their world dying above them, could sense their people being taken away one by one. But they had one last hope. One final act they could perform. The Vellani had spent centuries developing their mental abilities. They could speak mind to mind across vast distances, could share thoughts and feelings as easily as breathing. They had never tried to reach beyond their world, had never thought there might be other minds out there listening. Now, they had no choice but to try. The council joined their minds together, pooling their mental strength into one focused beam of thought. They reached out into the darkness between the stars, sending their plea into the empty void. They did not know if anyone would hear them. They did not know if anyone would care. They only knew they had to try. The message they sent was raw with emotion and pain. Images of their world as it had been, beautiful and peaceful. Images of their world as it was now, burning and broken. Images of their people being taken away in chains, children crying for parents they would never see again. And through it all, a simple plea that echoed across the galaxy: help us. Someone help us. As the last of their strength faded, the council felt their city crumble around them. The hegemony had found their hiding place. Cold mechanical hands reached down to drag them away to whatever fate awaited the last free Vellani. but their message was already traveling through space at the speed of thought. Carried by forces the hegemony could not detect or stop, 847 light-years away. On a small blue planet that had never been contacted by aliens, Dr. Sarah Chen sat in her laboratory, staring at readings that should have been impossible. The psionic detection equipment had been running for years without ever finding anything significant. But now, every sensor was screaming with activity, recording patterns of mental energy unlike anything in her databases. Sarah worked through the night, slowly decoding the alien transmission. When she finally understood what she was seeing, her hand shook as she reached for her phone. The images were clear enough. Another world, another people, suffering under an invasion that was still happening right now. And somehow, impossibly, their final message had reached Earth as dawn broke over her laboratory. Sarah knew that humanity was about to learn they were not alone in the universe. And the first thing they would learn was that someone out there needed their help desperately. The plea from Kepler for to be had reached Earth. Now the question was, what would humanity do about it? Dr. Sarah Chen had not slept in 36 hours. The alien message played on every screen in her laboratory, the images burning themselves into her memory. Children with silver skin and violet eyes, crying as mechanical soldiers dragged them away. Beautiful crystal cities crumbling under massive mining equipment. Peaceful world being torn apart by beings that showed no mercy. She had called everyone she could think of. The director of NASA sat in one chair, his face pale as he watched. The recordings. The Secretary of Defense stood by the window, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke in urgent whispers to the president. Scientists from around the world joined the video conference, their voices mixing together in a dozen languages as they tried to understand what they were seeing. The translation software had worked through the night, breaking down the alien language into something humans could understand. The message was simple and heartbreaking. The Villani were peaceful people who had never known war, had no weapons, no armies, no way to fight back against the hegemony. All they could do was send out their final plea and hope someone would hear them. President Elena Vasquez arrived at the laboratory within hours, her security team filling the hallways outside. She was a small woman with tired eyes, but when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of the entire world. She had seen the images, read the reports, understood what this meant for humanity. This was first contact with alien life. But it was not the peaceful meeting that scientists had dreamed. About 4 centuries, it was a cry for help from a dying civilization. And Earth had the power to answer that cry. The president called for an emergency session of the United Nations. Every country on Earth sent representatives to New York. The General Assembly Hall had never been so full, so tense, so focused on a single question. What should humanity do? The debate lasted for hours. Some delegates argued that Earth should focus on its own problems. Others worried that getting involved in an alien war would bring the hegemony to human space. The images from the Villani homeworld played on the massive screens showing the destruction happening in real time as they argued. Dr. Chen presented her analysis to the assembly. The Villani transmission had included star charts and coordinates. Their world was 847 light-years away, in a system called Kepler 442. The journey would take months, even with Earth's fastest ships. By the time any human force arrived, the Villani might already be extinct. Admiral Marcus Stone stepped up to the podium next. He was a tall man with gray hair and scars from the resource wars that had ended 20 years earlier. He had spent his entire career preparing Earth's defenses against threats that might come from space. He had never imagined the first threat would be against someone else. The Admiral's presentation was clear and frightening. The hegemony appeared to be a massive empire spanning dozens of star systems. Their technology was advanced, their ships were powerful, and they showed no mercy to those who opposed them. If Earth decided to intervene, it would not be a rescue mission. It would be war against an enemy they knew almost nothing about. The screens showed Earth's military capabilities. The Deep Space Defense Fleet had 200 ships, built to protect the solar system from asteroids and potential alien invasion. They had never been tested in real combat beyond training exercises. The largest ship, the Dreadnought Retribution, had enough firepower to destroy a small moon. But would it be enough against the hegemony? The debate continued through the night. Representatives from every nation spoke about duty, about risk, about what it meant to be human in a universe that was suddenly much larger and more dangerous than they had imagined. Some called for immediate action. Others demanded more information before committing to war. The breakthrough came when a delegate from Ghana stood up and asked a simple question. If we do nothing, and the hegemony continues to destroy other worlds, how long before they come to Earth? How long before our children are the ones crying for help while nobody answers? The vote was scheduled for the next day. But as the delegates left the assembly hall, something unexpected began to happen. News networks around the world had gotten hold of the alien transmission. The images of the Villani children, the burning cities, the desperate final message spread across every television, every computer, every phone on the planet. Humanity saw what was happening to the Villani, and something deep inside the human spirit reacted. Protests formed outside government buildings, not against war, but demanding action. Social media exploded with messages of support for the distant aliens. Children drew pictures of silver-skinned beings and asked their parents why nobody was helping them. The global reaction was unlike anything in human history. People who had never agreed on anything suddenly found themselves united by the simple idea that innocent beings were suffering and needed help. The images from Kepler 4:4 to be had awakened something primal in the human psyche, something that said, when someone calls for help, you answer. When the vote finally came, the result was overwhelming. 4,800,000,000 people voted. In favor of military intervention, 1,200,000,000 voted against. It was not even close. Humanity had made its choice. President Vasquez stood before the cameras that would broadcast. Her words to every corner of Earth. Her voice was steady as she spoke the words that would change human history forever. Today, we learn that we are not alone in the universe. We learn that there are other thinking beings among the stars, beings who can feel joy and pain just as we do. We also learn that these beings are in terrible danger, and that we have the power to help them. Some will say, this is not our fight. Some will say we should stay safe at home and let others handle their own problems. But that is not who we are. That is not who we choose to be. We are the species that hears a cry for help and answers, no. No matter how far away that cry comes from. Admiral Stone received his orders an hour later. He stood on the bridge of the Retribution, looking out at the orbital shipyards where every human vessel was being prepared for the longest journey in there. Species history? His crew worked around him, checking weapons systems and loading supplies for a war they might not survive. The Admiral opened the ship-wide communication channel and spoke the words that would echo through history. Prepare the Death Fleet. We are going to war. Across Earth's solar system, 200 ships began their final preparations. They would carry the hope and fury of an entire world across the galaxy, racing against time to save people they had never met from an enemy they barely understood. The Villani's Plea had reached Earth, and humanity was about to show the galaxy what happened when someone asked them for help. The orbital shipyards around Earth had never seen anything like it. Every construction bay worked without stopping day and night as humanity prepared for its first war among the stars. Sparks flew from welding torches as workers attached armor. Plating to cargo ships, mining vessels were fitted with missile launchers. Even the luxury cruise ships that carried tourists to Mars were being converted into troop transports. Commander Yuki Tanaka stood on the bridge of the Retribution, watching the controlled chaos outside her viewports. Ships of every size and shape filled the space around Earth, all of them being prepared for the 8-month journey to Kepler 442. Some were military vessels built for war. Others were civilian ships that had never fired a shot in anger. But all of them would be part of the Death Fleet. The name had come from a news reporter who saw the massive armada gathering in Earth's orbit. They call it the Death Fleet. He had said on the evening broadcast, because death is what they carry to those who would harm the innocent. The name stuck. Within days, every ship in the fleet wore the words Death Fleet on their hulls in letters that could be seen from space. Tanaka had commanded the Retribution for 3 years, but she had never expected to take her ship into real combat. Dreadnought was Earth's most powerful warship, armed with railguns that could punch through a kilometer of solid steel and nuclear torpedoes that could crack a moon in half. But even she wondered if it would be enough against the hegemony. The crew worked around her, preparing their ship for the longest voyage in human history. They were 500 men and women from every nation on Earth, volunteers who had signed up knowing they might never see home again. Some were career military officers who had trained their whole lives for war. Others were civilians who had joined after seeing the images from the Villani homeworld. Chief Engineer Rodriguez climbed up from the engine room, oil stains on his uniform and excitement in his eyes. Commander, the new fusion drives are running perfectly. We can maintain maximum burn for the entire journey without stopping. 8 months to Kepler 442, just like the Admiral promised. Across the fleet, similar scenes played out on 847 ships. The number was not a coincidence. Someone in Fleet Command had decided that 1 ship for every light year of distance would send the right message to the hegemony. Earth was not just sending a rescue mission, it was sending an army. Captain Morrison of the converted cargo hauler, New Hope, watched his crew load the last of their supplies. His ship had carried grain and manufactured goods between Earth and the outer colonies for 20 years. Now it carried 2,000 soldiers and enough weapons to level a city. The transformation had taken only 6 weeks, but it felt like his old ship had been reborn as something completely different. The civilians were the most surprising part of the mobilization. When Earth's governments called for volunteers, millions of people had stepped forward. Doctors and engineers, teachers and farmers, mechanics and scientists, all of them wanting to be part of humanity's answer to the Villani's plea. The military could only take a fraction of them, but those who were chosen brought skills that no army could train for. Dr. Lisa Park had been a pediatric surgeon at Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. Now she was chief medical officer aboard the transport ship Mercy, responsible for the health of 10,000 troops. She had volunteered the day after seeing the images of Villani children being taken by the hegemony. If we save even 1 alien child, she had told her family, this will all be worth it. Admiral Stone stood in the command center of the orbital station Zeus, watching the final preparations through the massive observation windows.
Ow.
The Death Fleet stretched as far as he could see in every direction. Heavy battleships and fast destroyers, supply ships and hospital ships, all of them painted with the same message in a dozen human languages. We heard you. We're coming. Intelligence reports were not encouraging. Long-range sensors had detected hegemony activity in 17 star systems between Earth and Kepler 442. The enemy empire was vast, with technology that seemed to match Earth's own in most areas. Their ships were heavily armed, and their crews appeared to be some kind of cyborg soldiers that felt no fear and showed no mercy. But the Death Fleet had advantages that the hegemony had never faced before. Human ships were designed by a species that had been fighting wars for thousands of years. Every weapon system had been tested in combat. Every tactic had been refined through countless battles. The hegemony conquered peaceful civilizations that had never learned to fight back. Now, they would face a species that had never learned to stop fighting. The final transmission from the Villani homeworld had arrived 3 days earlier. The signal was much weaker than before, transmitted by only a few remaining minds. The message was heartbreaking. We are almost gone now. The last of our cities have fallen. Our children are slaves. Our elders are dead. Our world is stripped bare. We do not know if anyone heard our first message. We do not know if help will ever come, but we wanted to say this. If someone out there is listening, do not let them make more ghosts like us. Do not let other worlds burn as ours has burned. Admiral Stone had shared the message with every ship captain in the fleet. The effect was immediate and profound. Crew members who had been nervous about fighting an unknown enemy suddenly found their resolve hardening into something unbreakable. The Villani were dying, but their sacrifice would not be forgotten. The Death Fleet would make sure of that. The launch sequence began at dawn on a Tuesday morning. One by one, the ships of the Death Fleet fired their engines and pulled away from Earth's orbit. The massive dreadnoughts led the way, followed by cruisers and destroyers. Then the converted civilian ships, carrying troops and supplies. It took 6 hours for the entire fleet to clear Earth's gravity well. Commander. Tanaka watched her homeworld shrink in the view screen as the Retribution reached the edge of the solar system. Earth looked small and blue and peaceful, completely. Unaware that its children were heading off to fight a war among distant stars, she touched the communication panel and opened a channel to the entire fleet. This is Commander Tanaka to all ships of the Death Fleet. We are beginning our jump to hyperspace. Our destination is Kepler 442, 847 light-years from home. Our mission is to stop the hegemony and save anyone we can save. We may be outnumbered, we may be outgunned, but we are not outmatched because we fight for something the hegemony cannot understand. We fight for people we have never met because that is what humans do. We answer when someone calls for help. The fleet engaged their hyperspace drives simultaneously. 847 ships disappearing from normal space in a burst of exotic energy. Behind them, Earth continued its ancient orbit around the sun. Unaware that its children had just taken the first step toward becoming the most feared military force in the galaxy. The Death Fleet was on its way to war. 8 months of hyperspace travel ended in a flash of light as the Death Fleet dropped back into normal space at the edge of the Kepler 4C2 system. Commander Tanaka felt her stomach lurch as the Retribution's artificial gravity adjusted to real physics again. Around her, the bridge crew worked quickly to get their sensors online and assess what they had found. What they discovered broke every heart in the fleet. The Villani. Homeworld hung in space like a dead thing, where once there had been blue oceans and golden continents, now there was only brown rock and poisoned atmosphere. The beautiful crystal cities that had floated above the surface were gone, reduced to mining pits that scarred the planet's face. Massive hegemony industrial platforms orbited the world like mechanical vultures, stripping away the last of its resources. Admiral Stone's voice came over the fleet communication channel. Despite the horror they were all seeing. Sensor. Sweep confirms no Villani life signs on the surface. The population appears to have been completely removed or eliminated. Hegemony forces are present in significant numbers throughout the system. Tactical display showed the enemy positions. 17 hegemony warships patrolled the inner system, their dark hulls bristling with weapons that humanity had never seen before. Mining stations dotted the asteroid belt, each one heavily defended. Most disturbing of all were the transport ships moving between planets, carrying cargo that the fleet's sensors could not identify. Lieutenant Kim at the sensor station turned to face Commander Tanaka, her face pale. Commander, I'm detecting organic signatures in those transport ships. The readings suggest they're carrying living beings, but the life signs are weak. Very weak. The implication hit everyone on the bridge at the same time. The hegemony was still harvesting people from this system, probably survivors they had missed in their first sweep or slaves taken from other conquered worlds. The Villani were gone. But there were others who still needed saving. Admiral Stone made the decision that would define the battle. Instead of a careful, planned assault, the Death Fleet would attack immediately. Every hour they waited meant more innocents would die or disappear into hegemony slave camps. The element of surprise was the only advantage they had, and they would use it. The first engagement happened at the system's edge, where 3 hegemony patrol ships encountered the human scout squadron. The alien vessels were larger than Earth's destroyers, covered in armor that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. But their crews had never faced an enemy that fought back with real determination. Captain Rodriguez of the destroyer Santiago opened fire first, his railguns sending streams of hypervelocity projectiles into the lead hegemony ship. The alien vessel's shields flared and died under the assault. Its return fire was powerful but poorly aimed, as if its crew could not believe anyone would dare attack them. The second hegemony ship tried to retreat, but the human ships were faster and more agile. Captain Morrison and the converted cargo hauler. New Hope proved that civilian ships could fight just as hard as military ones. His improvised missile batteries tore the alien ship apart before it could escape to warn the main fleet. The third hegemony. Vessel managed to send a brief transmission before the destroyer Manchester silenced it forever. But the damage was done. The main hegemony force now knew they were under attack. They would be ready for the human fleet's arrival. Commander Tanaka led the main assault on the hegemony fortress platforms orbiting the dead Villani world. The Retribution and 5 other dreadnoughts formed the spearhead of the attack, their massive guns blazing as they closed with the enemy. The hegemony returned fire with weapons that turned space itself into a weapon. But human ships were built to take damage and keep fighting. The battle was nothing like the clean tactical engagements that military planners had imagined. It was brutal and personal, fought by crews who had seen the images of Villani children and decided that some things were worth dying for. The human ships fought with a ferocity that the hegemony had never encountered. Using ramming attacks and suicide runs when their weapons were not enough, Dr. Park aboard the hospital ship Mercy watched the battle through the medical bay's viewports, her hands shaking as she prepared to receive casualties. She had volunteered to save lives, but watching human ships die in balls of fire made her understand that sometimes you had to destroy life to preserve it. The turning point came when the hegemony commander made a fatal mistake, seeing the human ships fight with what seemed like mindless aggression. He assumed they were a primitive species that relied on brute force instead of strategy. He concentrated his forces for a massive counterattack, leaving his support vessels undead-dite. Captain Sarah Chen, Dr. Chen's daughter, who had joined the fleet as a fighter pilot, led a squadron of small craft through the gap in the hegemony lines. Their target was the command ship that coordinated the enemy fleet. It was a suicide mission, and everyone knew it. But Chen's squadron dove into the enemy formation anyway, their small fighters weaving between massive alien weapons as they closed. On their target, Chen's ship was the only one to reach the hegemony command vessel, her fighter damaged in leaking atmosphere. She had 1 nuclear torpedo left, and she armed it manually as her ship's systems failed around her. Last transmission to the fleet was simple. "Tell my mother I heard the call for help too." The explosion that destroyed the hegemony command ship lit up the entire system. Without central coordination, the alien fleet began to fall apart. Individual ships tried to retreat or surrender, but the human crews were in no mood for mercy. They had come too far and seen too much to stop now. The battle for the Kepler 442 system lasted 72 hours. When it ended, every hegemony ship was either destroyed or disabled. The industrial platforms that had been strip mining the Villani homeworld were burning wrecks. The transport ships carrying slaves had been captured, their human cargo freed and given medical attention. Admiral Stone stood on the bridge of his flagship, looking out at the debris field that had once been the hegemony's occupation force. The victory was complete, but it felt hollow. It arrived too late to save the Villani. Entire civilization was gone, turned to dust by an empire that saw other beings as nothing more than resources to be harvested. But in the wreckage of the hegemony ships, human salvage teams made a discovery that changed everything. The alien computers contained star charts showing dozens of other systems under hegemony control. Worlds where other species were being enslaved and destroyed. Billions of innocent beings who were suffering just as the Villani had suffered. The Death Fleet had won its first battle, but the war was just beginning. Somewhere out there, other voices were calling for help. And now they knew that when someone called, humanity would answer with overwhelming force. The message had been sent. Written in fire and debris across the Kepler 442 system, the hegemony's reign of terror was coming to an end. Admiral Stone stood in the ruins of the hegemony command center, surrounded by the wreckage of alien computers and control panels. The battle was over, but the work of understanding what they had found was just beginning. Human technicians worked around him, downloading data from the enemy systems and translating the information into something their commanders could understand. What they discovered changed everything. The hegemony database contained records of 47 different species that had been conquered and enslaved. 12 other civilizations had been driven to complete extinction, their worlds stripped bare like the Villani homeworld. The empire stretched across hundreds of star systems, each one containing billions of enslaved beings who had no hope of Freedom. Lieutenant Chen, the sister of the pilot who had died destroying the Hegemony command ship, worked at one of the alien terminals. Her eyes were red from crying, but her hands were steady as she pulled up file after file of horror. "Admiral, you need to see this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The screen showed a map of Hegemony space, with colored dots marking each conquered system. Red dots were worlds that had been completely destroyed. Yellow dots were planets still being harvested for resources. Green dots were systems where the population had been enslaved, but was still alive. There were hundreds of green dots, but more important than the map was what the communications array had detected. Across the galaxy, other species were talking. About the human attack on Kepler 442, word was spreading that someone had finally fought back against the Hegemonian one. On a dozen worlds, slave populations were beginning to rebel, inspired by news that help might be coming. Commander Tanaka joined the admiral in the command center. Her uniform stained with smoke from the battle, but her spirit unbroken. She had lost 30% of her crew in the fighting, good people who had volunteered to save strangers they would never meet. Their sacrifice weighed heavily on her heart, but she knew they had died for something important. "What are your orders, Admiral?" she asked. "Do we return to Earth to report our success, or do we continue the mission?" It was the question that would define humanity's place in the galaxy. The Death Fleet had accomplished what it came to do. They had answered the Villani's call for help, even if they had arrived too late. They could return home as heroes, the species that had traveled across the galaxy to fight for justice. Earth would welcome them with parades and celebrations. But the database showed that there were other worlds where the same horrors were happening right now. Other species being enslaved, other children being taken from their families, other civilizations being ground into dust by the Hegemony's machines. If the Death Fleet returned to Earth, those beings would die without ever knowing that someone had tried to help them. Admiral Stone looked around at his officers, seeing the same conflict in their eyes that he felt in his heart. They were tired, damaged, far from home. They had lost friends and comrades in the battle, but they were also human, and humans had a very specific response to learning that innocents were suffering. "Send a message to all ship captains," the admiral said finally. "We're holding a fleet-wide vote. Every person in the Death Fleet gets to decide. Do we go home, or do we finish what we started?" The vote took place over the next 24 hours. On every ship in the fleet, from the massive dreadnoughts to the smallest converted cargo vessels, crews gathered to make their choice. The decision was not just about military strategy or political objectives. It was about what kind of species humanity wanted to be. Dr. Park stood before the crew of the hospital ship Mercy, her medical staff, and the soldiers they had treated during the battle. "We came here to save the Villani," she said. "We failed. We were already gone when we arrived, but we can still save others. The question is, are we the kind of people who save one world and go home, or are we the kind who keep fighting until everyone is free?" The vote was not even close. 93% of the Death Fleet chose to continue the war. They would not return to Earth until the hegemony was destroyed and every enslaved world was free. It was a decision that would change the course of galactic history. Commander Tanaka led the first liberation mission to a nearby hegemony system where the database showed a species called the Keth were being held in labor camps. The attack was swift and decisive. Human ships had learned from the battle at Kepler 442. They struck the hegemony forces before the enemy could organize a defense. The Keths were reptilian beings with green scales and golden eyes, and they wept when human soldiers broke down the doors of their prison camps. They had been enslaved for 60 years, working in mines and factories while their children were taken away for genetic experiments. They had given up hope of ever seeing freedom again. But the most important moment came when the Keth elders asked who the humans were and why they had come. Commander Tanaka's answer was simple. "We heard someone calling for help. That's what we do." Word of the liberation spread faster than the Death Fleet could travel. On worlds throughout hegemony space, enslaved populations began to rebel. They sabotaged factories, freed prisoners, and attacked their overseers with tools and improvised weapons. The hegemony had built their empire on the assumption that conquered peoples would stay conquered. They had never faced a galaxy-wide uprising. The human fleet split into smaller task forces, each one targeting a different hegemony system. They moved like a wildfire through enemy space, liberating world after world and recruiting freed slaves. To join their cause, the Death Fleet became something more than a military force. It became a movement, a promise that no call for help would go unanswered. Admiral Stone established a permanent base in the Kepler 442 system, turning the ruins of the hegemony platforms into a command center for the Liberation War. From there, he coordinated attacks across hundreds of star systems, always moving, always fighting, always freeing more worlds from hegemony control. 3 years after the Death Fleet had left Earth, Admiral Stone stood before a communication array that would broadcast his words across the entire galaxy. Representatives from 47 freed species stood behind him, beings of every shape and size united by their shared experience of oppression and liberation. The message he sent would be heard on every world that had the technology to receive. This is Admiral Marcus Stone of the Earth Defense Fleet, broadcasting from the liberated Kepler 442 system. 3 years ago, we received a call for help from a peaceful people called the Villani. We arrived too late to save them, but their sacrifice was not in vain. Today, I am proud to announce that the hegemony is no more.
Ow.
Their empire has fallen, their fleets are destroyed, and their slaves are free. The Admiral paused, looking out. At the stars where human ships continued their patrols, protecting the fragile peace they had built. To any species listening to this message, know this: you are not alone in the universe. If oppression comes to your world, call out into the darkness. If slavery threatens your people, send your plea across the stars. Humanity is listening, and we will answer. We are not the strongest species in the galaxy, nor the smartest, nor the most advanced. But we are the ones who come when you call for help. That is who we are. That is who we choose to be. The Death Fleet had become something greater than anyone had imagined. They were no longer just Earth's military force. They were the galaxy's conscience, the promise that no innocent would suffer alone. The Villani's final message had reached across the stars to find the one species that would never ignore a cry for help. Humanity had found its place among the stars.